We are back, Dr. Elizabeth and Reverend Rick, and our dialogues about this wonderful book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. If you haven't been with us to this point, I'll just say that we can't contain ourselves with our enthusiasm for the positive way that Heather McGhee has approached these terrible problems that we face as a society. And we're on a chapter that really is exciting, and we're going to make this our penultimate dialogue and save the last chapter for another session because it too is great, right, Elizabeth? What is it about?
Oh yeah, the last chapter is like all the hope in the world.
And what is it that gets us so excited, you and me, about this chapter called The Hidden Wound? What does she do in this chapter that makes it so good?
I think it has a lot. I mean, the focus of the chapter is that white folks have a wound from racism that they are unaware of. And that results in our cutting ourselves off from other folks whose lives and life stories can bring meaning and growth to us. It means that as long as we don't acknowledge that we've been wounded, we wind up in defensive postures, feeling overwhelmed by the economic and racial injustices of our country, and we don't know how to make it better, so we feel guilty. And what I really appreciated about this book, and I've done a lot of anti-racism training in the course of my life, but what I really like about this book is the way in which she invites us to just put the burden down. We choose whether or not we want to be wounded by this. And it's not about making us feel guilty. It's not about who we are as individual persons. It's about how we participate in a system. And once we identify the system, which she calls the zero-sum game, that frees up the space in us to grieve the wound that racism has given us, but also it invites us to see new ways in which we can live with one another, and not only live, but thrive.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I felt the same way. And let's say a little more about the wound, because it's a strong word, and what she's referring to in my view is she's referring to the realization that whites have, you might say secretly or privately have, of the gravity of the offense and the tragedy that we have committed upon our society, and in particular people of color in our society, and that the burden of that history is so great that whites are not just not willing, but not able to put our arms around that. And she acknowledges that, I think, and it's proper to do so, and to say and to validate that as a feeling, because the enormity of this is well, it's almost beyond comprehension, and it seems to be beyond addressing in some corrective, reparative way. But you're right, this is different than guilt. That guilt is very disempowering. Then you disconnect and you go into your misery, or you avoid your misery just by shutting off the subject. And that's what
or you become defensive and a white supremacist.
Right. But to say that our history is a burden, it strikes me as a good move on her part to talk about the wound of that's hidden in white lives. And she picks this up much later. We don't need to go there yet, but she cites, this is a term, this is a title of a book by Wendell Berry,
Mm-hmm.
who acknowledges, this is a white writer, a very famous poet and essayist
Mm-hmm.
from Kentucky in ecology and spirituality, actually, in which he says, we have a hurt that we think or know we can't heal. And to realize that is just a grievous insult to our sense of capacity, our sense of, the
Mm-hmm.
American we can fix this mentality. Well, not the way we might think. But she goes beyond, quickly after, if you will, sympathizing. I don't know if that's quite the word for it, but understanding, validating, let's say, validating.
Mm-hmm.
She then talks about the absence of white moral leadership, and
Mm-hmm.
and the vacuum that exists there, which is where it pinches us in Christian churches anyway, because we want to be a beacon of hope and a beacon of progressive social policy, but where is the platform? Where is the megaphone for this? And who can manage it? What story should we talk a little bit about the story she tells about Angela King, who is or was, I guess, is a white woman who, as a youngster, became a Nazi sympathizer and a
White
skinhead,
supremacist.
white supremacist.
Aryans. Yeah.
And she became a white supremacist almost through a back door. That kind of interested me, that she'd been bullied in school in terrible ways, and as a girl, this was not racially oriented. But the result is that it turned her into a bully. And so she just adopted as her targets the targets that her parents had, who were very prejudiced people, about race and sexuality and all kinds of stuff. So she just turned on an engine almost arbitrarily. She had to strike out at the world,
Mm-hmm.
and so I thought that was a very curious story to tell. What did you make of it?
I think it goes back to some of the early chapters here, where folks who, felt disempowered or bullied or whatever, rather than see their commonality with the people at the bottom of the system,
Mhm.
who are largely people of color, and identifying with them, and perhaps joining together to change some of the things about their lives that she found difficult. It was much easier to claim some kind of special privilege that validated her sense of self-worth in comparison to her Black and brown, the people around her. And that again is the illustration of the zero-sum game. She had to claim power for herself, and to have given any power away would have meant she lost something.
And where did she learn the big lesson that turned her around? Because the end of the story is that she comes out the other side, but she is sent up to the clink. She's sent up to jail.
Mm-hmm.
For some offense or other, in which she was there for a couple of years, and obviously had to interact with a lot of people of color, and she shunned them. But the women, some of them, one of them in particular, invited her to sit down and talk during recess, and that led to a growing conversation. And she identified with the difficulties of this Black woman. But then that was the prelude to a much deeper conversation, because it led to the hard conversation about white attitudes and systemic racism and personal prejudice and so forth. And she eventually, did she write a book, or did she just come up with the phrase that she had arrived at life after hate?
I'm not sure,
Yeah.
but she that's the phrase she uses, is life after hate.
Right, it's a great phrase. And so she was able to come around and approach the issue of white reconciliation with our own history to good effect, to better effect anyway. There is a correction she makes in, did I stop you?
No, go ahead.
There was a correction she did introduce that was very needful, because I've been in meetings where I've heard this phrase before, which is colorblindness, which is an excuse, or I shouldn't say an excuse, it's a claim, rather. It's a claim white people make to say, well, I'm not prejudiced, I'm colorblind. Well, she says, who on earth can possibly be colorblind when you're confronted with the most obvious personal physical fact of other people, which is the color of our skin. So she challenges that and challenges the fact that it's been used as a legal weapon, but it's not an asset, she says, to whites. It's not doing what we really need. We don't need to be claiming that, and we shouldn't be claiming it if we want to get past these barriers.
Well, and on a personal level, I feel like it has kept me from hearing people's stories. While yes, humankind is one great family, we're all distinct people within our families. And when we claim that colorblindness, we're not allowing the full personhood of the individual standing in front of us. We're not hearing their whole story, and it disconnects us from one another in a very powerful way.
There's a respect in which I do acknowledge, because as I said, I've sat and listened to them, and as I know the people who have said such things, I do acknowledge the fact that in some cases, though, although you're completely right on that score, and it's true of the people I'm talking about, but I think some of them want to say is, I judge people equally. I'm not blind to the color in the sense of physically blind to knowing, what a different history they must have. But I think sometimes what is meant is simply, I try to judge people equally, despite differences of any kind. But Heather is talking about something much more widespread and much more profound, which is the claim that I don't see a problem here. I don't see why there is a problem.
Well, and that is where I think the work for the church is. She talks a lot about redemption in this chapter, and in the way we have allowed racism to distort our view of others as made in the image of God. And she writes that redemption isn't a miracle. It's actually built into the structure of the world. And therefore, racism is an impediment to the structure of the world, of a redeemed world. And I found that really, really powerful.
That's another one of her great phrasings that she gives. Absolutely.
And that's the work of the church. The church is about honoring God by honoring the image of God in the brothers and sisters around us. It is about looking at ourselves, not to make ourselves feel guilty, but to help us understand what our responsibilities as Christians are
That's right.
in the act of redeeming the world.
Well, there is a little snippet that she drops in into the narrative about, I don't know whether it was Angela King or another particular person who goes to the Bible. Oh, no, her parents are very prejudiced.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, oh, well, you know, we're against blacks because they're inferior and that's what the Bible says. Well, the young person challenges that and gets the Bible out and say, where in the Bible do you see that? And so again, that's another job for the church, is to just repeat these corrections as best we can. And we've been trying to do that on Sunday mornings with our, you know, get the printed word off the page series on different words, is to, you know, open up the Bible and get those words off the page.
You know, one of the things that is foundational for me as a Christian is that Jesus makes it possible for me to see the image of God in other people. And as I have gotten older, and as I have been in more multicultural environments, that's such a huge gift to see God in the face of another. And she points to a conversation she had with a Muslim who was quoting the Quran. Allah proclaims to humankind that we made you into nations and tribes so that you may know each other, not that you may despise each other. And I think that is, you know, as I think of the community that I would like to live in, the world I would like to be a part of, I feel like I've missed out on so much because I'm a white woman of privilege.
Well, that's right. We walk our, you know, preset paths, and we have our preset channels like people do on their television sets, and it's because of where we live, where we walk, and certainly that is another strength of this particular church, Elliott Church, because we do attempt to maintain a connection with the larger part of the city, which is not affluent and not privileged at all. And we've got
the congregation is very generous in, you know, sharing their gifts and their blessings with others.
It's true. And I want to mention a dream. I think I based a sermon on this once. Stop me, I don't want to give another sermon, but I had a dream once along the lines of what you were talking about, the gift that Jesus makes to enable us to see the image of God in other people. And the dream was that people, I was in a city intersection, and there were a lot of big buildings, and people were coming and going and coming out of the buildings. Maybe it was a Sunday morning, but everybody was in extraordinary costumes. The people of color were dressed in, you know, if you've ever seen a movie, Shakespeare movie, all the Renaissance regalia. They were walking and bearing themselves as royalty, as indeed they should. But so were other ethnicities and people in their, you know, respectively different ways. And so nobody was, you know, out in their, you know, whatever, what we call street clothes, t-shirts and whatnot. The world was this dream. In this dream, the people were dressed appropriately as reflecting the image of God.
And that's such a beautiful and redeeming image. You know, there is, in the kingdom of God we are called to build, there is room for everyone. And I take issue with Paul, or I guess it's Peter in this case, who talks about God having no partiality. I think God is partial. I think God is partial to each one of us, that, you know, our uniqueness and our humanness and the things that make us who we are, God loves with an impartial favor. I mean, you know, God is partial to us. God is for us. God is on our side. And that's true for everybody else.
Mhm.
And your dream gives me that vision of not quite Peter and the winding sheet, but the image that in our particularity,
Mhm.
this is who I am as a woman of color. This is who I am as, you know, a scholar at this place. Those are the things that we're being invited to bring into community.
Well, preach it, sister. You got the gospel right there. You got it. And we need to put that up on a flagpole. Listen, and going on ahead with the corrections that she introduces before we have
Yep.
to wind up our time, but she does bring up a title called of a book called "Dying of Whiteness." Another great phrase that wasn't hers in this case, but
It's
it
Robin
refers to
DiAngelo's, isn't it?
could have been "Dying of
Yeah,
Whiteness." Mhm.
I think it
Well,
is.
it's about gun ownership and how whites have gone and armed themselves, and with every incident of police brutality against blacks or the election of a black president, all of a sudden the gun sales go up, and we're of course then the accessibility of all these weapons in people's homes means that more people die accidentally and unnecessarily, and but she does ask toward the end, I'm saving up my favorite phrase practically of the whole book because it comes at the end of this chapter. But she does say she wonders, she doesn't have an answer to the question, how did our country's moral progress stall? Because it felt like we had a little unanimity going. We had the law going for us, and you know, the voting rights and the equal rights laws and so forth. We had, and she says, you know, it's a perplexity to her, but she ends for me on the greatest line of all, which is a warning, which is to say, racism destroys every path to the promised land. Racism destroys every path to the promised land. End quote. And if she, you know, if any of us harbor visions of a promised land, we better be warned that, you know, prejudicial behavior and thought is not going to get us there.
No, we really have to come to the place where we claim that solidarity dividend.
Right.
You know, that to be, and again, I think this is a place where the church has a really important role. You know, when we gather around the table, we gather in a somewhat mystical way with all of humankind, you know, that we are the place that should be calling everyone to the table, calling everyone to celebrate who they are. And we get, you know, we're human, and we get stuck up and, you know, caught up in stupid little petty things that don't really matter in the end. But we have that vision at the table of the human family whole. And I don't think we take advantage enough of that when we preach and we teach on it. This is a place, churches are supposed to be the place where we come to work out this stuff. This is how we begin to enter into reconciliation, which ultimately leads us to the redemption of the world that Jesus promises us. And we better not get in the way of that. Maybe part of the reason why churches are dying is because we're in the way of the vision that Jesus has.
Wow. Well, now there's a thought, and I have to say, I recognize the truth of what you're saying. We can we can project, though, the hope. And that is our job, to
Absolutely.
project that hope. And also, I think, to do the job that Heather McGhee is challenging us to do, which is to assume some moral leadership and to say, okay, on Sunday morning, we're at this banquet at which all people are present. You can't see them all because we're segregated on Sunday, but really, we're not the only ones that belong at this privileged table. And, you know, when you were speaking, it reminded me of the conclusion of that movie called Places in the Heart with Sally Field. I don't know if you remember it,
I don't.
1980s. Well, it's a story about a white woman in the South who needs to keep her family going on a farm that's about to die, and a black man comes and signs on as her handyman, and the two of them get through some crises together and through some village prejudice and so forth that was rather hateful. But the last scene is everybody coming in to church on Sunday morning, and they're all there, all the people that said the hateful things and did the violence against blacks, as well as the black families and Sally Field herself. It was a very touching. It's Places in the Heart. I recommend it. It's a wonderful. It's an inspiring film. Well, listen.
Well, I think that's the vision that this book has offered us, and some concrete steps to naming what is keeping us from that vision.
Well, let's make an inventory of those before our next dialogue, and we'll bring them as we prepare to talk about the solidarity dividend. It's the last chapter in this book. And
it's the most hopeful thing you will read this year.
Well, that's a good incentive to go out and buy the book and read the whole thing in time for this next discussion. Well, Dr. Elizabeth, I'm going to say adieu for the time being. Adieu, adieu, adieu. Isn't that
Au revoir.
Well, that's how Sound of Music ended, remember?
Yes, I do. I do. You should teach an adult education class on movies and faith.
Oh, yeah? Well, I might take you up on that. Actually, yeah. I might. Okay. Bye to you, Dr. Elizabeth, and everybody else. We'll see you for one more installment next time. Okay.
Blessings all.
Blessings to all. Bye.